Does anyone in the audience know what characterizes a public good? Non-excludable, non-rivalrous goods. That's just jargon for saying goods that we can't stop people from using once they're out. And when we use it, it doesn't stop anyone else from using it. So I wanted to talk about 3 things about public goods. And those are why we should fund public goods, how we could fund public goods, and then what you guys could do to help fund public goods. So, yeah, just to give a brief, economics 101 on why we want to fund public goods. Economists will say that the externalities presented by public goods aren't internalized properly by the market, but what they're trying to say is that the free market just sucks at providing public goods, so we need to do something about that. And just to give a motivating example, let's say we have this developer, Alice, who wants to write free open source software, but each block of code that she writes gets more and more difficult for her to commit. So let's say it costs her X monies to produce an additional block of code, and then we as users value each additional block of code slightly less. So the first block of code we value at 99 monies, then the second at 98, the third at 97, and so on. So now my question to you is, in a free market where we all kind of barter individually with Alice to try and pay her to provide this free open source software, how many blocks or lines of code do you reckon that she will commit? And assume there are more than 100 of us that want this code to be out. Does anyone have an idea? Okay, so because we have to pay her for each line of code, once we get to 50 lines or 50 blocks of code, the 51st block of code is just not worth it for us because it costs us 51 monies, but we only gain 49 monies of value from that block. So, but it's actually not the kind of socially optimal solution, because if we could all commit to split the bill amongst ourselves, because there are hundreds of us, right? We could all pool our money together and become this one unified actor. Then we get to a world where 99 lines of codes are committed. If anyone wants the derivation and proof of that, come see me after the talk. But intuitively, it's just that because once this code exists, we can all use it. We can all split the bill and pay less than $1 for the last line of code. Yeah. So now the question becomes, how do we implement this in practice? How can we force users to split a bill equally amongst themselves? And this is something that Martin touched on in his in the first presentation. Does anyone have a guess on a handy economic tool we could use? Inflation? Has anyone heard of this? So it's this magical tool where we can inflate the money supply, bringing the purchasing power down in a way that anyone that holds money is paying for this tax. Then we can use this tax to fund public goods. And on Namada, we've come up with 2 ways that we want to use this tax to fund public goods. We have continuous public goods funding, which is a continuous payment meant to go towards projects that we want to come to fruition. And then retroactive public goods funding, which I'm sure many of you have heard of before. It's something that Optimism is a big fan of. And it's basically we send lump sum money to projects that have already existed and we know have provided social utility. So continuous PGF aims to answer the question that I presented in my example of Alice. Basically, how much does a society want to pay for a good in order for it to exist in the future? Whereas retroactive PGF seeks to answer the retroactive question of how much would society pay for a time traveler not to go back in the past and delete a public good from existence that we have today. And CPGF and RPGF have like many different pros and cons attached to them. And I wanted to go a slightly bit deeper into the cost of each of them. And it turns out that through a bunch of math that we don't need to talk about now, RPGF, if you wanted to make it backwards incentive compatible, meaning like if I want to use RPGF as a tool to incentivize people today to make public goods in the future with some like probability of gaining or like receiving public like RPGF in the future, then we need to compensate them for a risk that they're taking on today. And we assume that most people are somewhat risk averse. And because of this, we need to pay like a risk premium to them for taking on this endeavor. So two researchers, Groom and Madison, did a survey in the UK where they estimated that this like risk averseness parameter is around like 1.5. That's given by Ada. But when I was thinking about this, in the crypto world, I mean, GM degens, we might actually be operating under different assumptions. So I believe that ADA here is definitely lower. And if we get to an ADA that is negative, we get into this like risk-loving territory where agents like will pay to take on like this gamble, right? And then RPGF actually becomes cheaper than any other alternative for public goods funding. And that's something we'll need to experiment with, but something to be very excited about. So now we've gone over all the theories, so I want to talk about what you guys could do today to help fund public goods using Namada. So we have, on Namada, we have PGF councils, which are democratically elected through governance, that may spend up to 10% of total NAM, which is our like base currency, and direct that towards public goods funding. I say up to 10% because councils need to declare like a spending cap that they will use before they're voted on. But once they've been elected, they then can either choose to conduct CPGF by listing a bunch of addresses and amounts that they'll be sending continuously to projects that they want to come to fruition, or just make lump sum transfers to goods or projects that they believe are providing a lot of value today. But Namada hasn't launched yet, so why am I talking about this today and not in a month's time? Well, before we launch Namada, we have a Genesis block, and in this Genesis block, we want to allocate a minimum of 20% of total NAM supply towards retroactive public goods funding. And then we also want to elect our first PGF council that will make decisions up until the point where we vote in the next PGF council. So our RPGF nominations are open to everyone, and all you need to do is write a blog post saying, with some motivation as to who you think would be a good nominee for public goods funding. And I highly recommend you do this as soon as possible because the window of the deadline is approaching quickly. And then if you have any questions about this, please email me. My email is on the screen. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to talk about, and thank you all for listening.